policy research. We at CPPR are hosting a series of webinars tracing recent developments in Afghanistan and evaluating the changing dynamics associated with the Afghanistan political crisis and its future prospects. We have been engaging experts from the realm of academia, think tanks, and the media. This is the third webinar of the series on the Afghan political crisis, regional and global implications. CPPR, the Center for Public Policy Research, is an independent think tank, a public policy organization dedicated to in-depth research and scientific analysis with the objective of delivering actionable ideas that could transform society. We are based out of Kochi in the Indian state of Kerala. Our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformation in the areas of urban reform, livelihood, education, health, governance, law, international relations, and security. We also have a training and development arm called CPPR Academy. You can find all the content related to this webinar on our website, www.cppr.in, and on our social media accounts. If you would like to tweet about our webinar, please use hashtag CPPR webinar and tag the Twitter handle @CPPR India. So before we begin our interesting discussion on this topic, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all the participants who have logged in today from across the world. We look forward to engaging with you to enrich today's discussion. To put in your questions to our speaker, you can add them in the chat box below, and we will pose your questions to the speaker. With this, I'd like to introduce the host and speaker for the day, Dr. Shelley Johnny and Dr. C. Christine Fair. Dr. Shelley Johnny is an assistant professor of political science at the St. Aloysius College, Thrissur, Kerala. He has held research positions at the Center for Air Power Studies, which is a think tank of the Indian Air Force, and the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, IDA, which is under the Ministry of Defense, Government of India. His research interests include contemporary West Asia, with a special emphasis on the Arab Gulf states, Iran, Iraq, the Hezbollah, and the Afghan region. Within this, his research focus is on the nature and development of ongoing conflicts in the region and the overall security and terrorism-related aspects. He is a senior fellow for West Asian and Security Studies at CPPR. Dr. C. Christine Fair is a professor in the Peace and Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. She has previously served as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation, a political officer with the United Nations Afghanistan in Kabul, and a senior research associate at USIP's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She has also served as a senior fellow at the West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. She has been a senior resident fellow at the Institute for Defense and Security Studies, New Delhi, IDSA, which Shelley sir has also been a part of. And she has been a Reagan Feshel Democracy Fellow. Her research focuses on political and military affairs in South Asia, so covering Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. She has authored many books, the most recent being, in their own words, Understanding the Lashkar-e-Taiba, that was published by Oxford University Press. She is also a frequent commentator on television and radio, including CBS, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, The Voice of America, Fox, Reuters, NPR, among others. So she has also given extensive interviews to journalists with New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the list goes on. So a warm welcome to you both, and over to you, Dr. Shelley, to commence the discussion.
Thank you, Purvaja. Welcome, Professor Fair. It's an honor to interact with you in this session. We know that Afghanistan has entered a new stage with the Taliban coming back to power after almost 20 years in very changed regional and global circumstances. So in today's session, we'll be speaking about this very important development. And I welcome Professor Fair to share her views on this topic. Welcome, Professor Fair.
Thank you for having me. So I thought you were going to make some opening characterizations of the problem set.
Okay. I thought that, if you wanted to make your introductory remarks first,
Oh, no.
20 minutes. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to present some kind of focus areas or something and go on to the?
Yeah, I mean, why don't we just do it as a discussion?
Okay. So yeah. So we know that this is what has happened in Afghanistan is a very major development. That is, as I mentioned earlier, after almost 20 years, the Taliban has come back to power in Afghanistan under very changed circumstances, both regionally and globally. So, and we know that there are more number of non-state actors in the Pak region. And this makes the situation very complicated because it's much more difficult to predict or even to comprehend what is likely to happen in the coming months, and what are the likelihoods of what kind of alliances are likely to emerge, and the shifting patterns of conflict, alliances, and rivalries that are likely to emerge in such an environment. So, in taking this into context, the first point that I would like to discuss with you is what are the likely challenges and opportunities for the Islamic State of Khorasan province in Afghanistan, now that the Taliban has assumed complete control after the withdrawal of US troops and the collapse of the former Afghan government. What is likely to be the nature of their activities in this context? That is what I wanted to discuss with you.
So I don't know. I mean, I've been of the view that the Islamic State in Afghanistan has largely been exaggerated. For the most part, they're former Taliban that, for whatever reason, have became disaffected by the organization or its relationship with Pakistan. And another part of the Islamic State actually comes from Pakistan itself, because they're individuals who were previously a part of Lashkar Jangvi or CPPR Pakistan and went to Afghanistan. So for many years, I have come to be persuaded by it. The Afghans were arguing that the Pakistanis had been investing in the Islamic State as a way of kind of keeping a check on the Taliban. And I think that argument has quite a bit of merit. For quite some time, Afghans used to joke that it's not ISIS, it's ISI. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. I mean, for example, the suicide attack in Kabul, who did it principally benefit? Well, it principally benefited the Pakistanis, because the Pakistanis are once again trying to sell their snake catching expertise. And at the same time, it also strengthened the hands of the Taliban, right? Making the case, persuasively or not, that people who care about the Islamic State should be supporting the Taliban regime. So I'm of the old school, look to see who benefits to try to understand what the motivations were. So I think the ISI is going to essentially use the Islamic State against the Taliban if the Taliban forget who facilitated this victory.
Yeah, that is quite interesting, because connecting to the next point that I wanted to discuss with you, because as you mentioned, the role of the ISI in promoting the Islamic State in Afghanistan for their own interests. Closely related to this is the nature of the relations between the Islamic State and the Haqqani network within the Afghan Taliban. So what is the nature of this relationship, and do you expect any kind of changes in the kind of relationship between the Islamic State and the Haqqani network? Because we have had reports about collaboration between these two elements in conducting attacks in Afghanistan. So is there any kind, I mean, are these reports credible that there are relations between the Islamic State and the Haqqani network? And if so, do you see any kind of change in this relationship now that the Taliban has come to power?
So, I mean, for the most part, Haqqani has always been allied with Al-Qaeda. So if there were collaborations with ISIS, it would have been for very specific purposes and for purposes of opportunity, not for purposes of strategy. So I don't think this is a relationship that I spend a lot of time on because, as I said, you know, different militant organizations, they collaborate for very opportunistic reasons, but the primary relationship has always been Haqqani, Al-Qaeda, and at different points in time, the Taliban. And of course, the Haqqani network is ensconced in the Taliban so-called cabinet.
So, which means that whatever kind of attacks that do take place, if there is any kind of collaboration, it is for specific objectives rather than any kind of deeper and kind of alliance between the Islamic State and the Haqqani network. That is what I understand from what you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't understand the fetishization of Islamic State in Afghanistan, right? It's not the primary source of violence in Afghanistan. The primary source of violence in Afghanistan is the Taliban. I know over the years, like Russia, for example, made a lot of hay over the Islamic State in Afghanistan. And the reason why it did that was to provide it cover for its deepening relations with the Taliban. So, you know, I'm a cynic about the importance of Islamic State in Afghanistan. I think the larger problem is that Afghanistan is being governed by a terrorist organization. And there are parts of Afghanistan where Islamic State have typically rooted themselves. For example, in Kunar and Nangarhar, where there is no state penetration. I don't think the Taliban are any more effective in taking it on. We know that during the American presence, there were times when the U.S. air assets bombed the Islamic State on behalf of the Taliban, which is kind of an interesting story. They didn't officially coordinate those air attacks, but you know, the Taliban didn't have very good secure communication, so we knew that the Taliban were being bogged down in this fight with ISIS, and so the Americans sent some air assets to drop some ordnance on Islamic State. So I think the biggest problem is the fact that Afghanistan is currently in the hands of a terrorist organization, and there are members in its cabinet which are FTOs. So that to me is the problem, the basic problem. Obviously, there's going to be many individuals are going to flock to Afghanistan, just as they did ISIS previously. The global landscape of jihadi activists have been revivified by the Taliban victory. So that is the much larger problem with Afghanistan, is that it's now a destination for jihadi tourists who are looking for opportunities to develop their jihadi skill set. So all of those things, ISIS, the draw of others to Afghanistan, that is all second order problems. But the first order problem is the fact that Afghanistan is presently in the hands of the Taliban, which is a terrorist organization. It has not been declared a terrorist organization, to be clear, by the UN, by the United States, for political reasons, right? It hasn't been designated for political reasons, but that does not obfuscate the basic fact that it is a terrorist organization. It terrorizes civilians, it kills civilians, to not win the hearts and minds of Afghans, but to terrorize the hearts and minds of Afghans. And it's also a proxy organization, right? Had it not been for Pakistan's unstinting support to the organization, it would have been a nuisance, right? It would not have been something that the United States and its NATO allies could not have managed, right? We know that Pakistan's unstinting and comprehensive support to the organization is what really brought the Taliban back into power.
So, like when we're focusing on the Taliban, what is the difference in the nature of the factionalism within the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban? I mean, what is the nature of the differences in the nature of factionalism in the Afghan Taliban during the 1990s or the early 2000s and in the present juncture? Has like factionalism increased within the Taliban because of the insurgency or any other reason per se?
I mean, I think there are many lines of or fissures that run across the different, I'm not sure what the word is, Taliban constituencies within the organization. So I think overall, this Taliban organization taken as a whole is much more dangerous than the previous Taliban organization. Its links to Al-Qaeda and other global extremists is much more significant than it ever was in Taliban 1.0. So you do have one of the more obvious schisms is between the so-called old guard and I guess we would call them, just by virtue of math, these younger commanders that have passed through the last 20 years. And then you have these different shuras, right? You have the Doha faction, which became kind of this, thanks to Zalmay Khalilzad and other complicit governments, kind of became media darlings, which is sort of an interesting concept to think about Taliban 1.0 and how they eschewed media and how they eschewed technology. Through this process, they actually became quite savvy in manipulating international media and sort of engaging with it. You have all of these other shuras, the Rawalpindi Shura, of course, being important amongst them. So it's inevitable that there are going to be these differences across the organization. But if this were an organization that just operated on its own, this would not be propitious, that you would have all of these schisms that are in many ways irreconcilable. But remember, this is not an organization that exists on its own. The ISI is very much vested in this organization retaining control of Afghanistan. And the ISI is perfectly happy with these fissures, right? Because these are fissures that it can exploit to ensure that the organization remains dependent upon the ISI. So the ISI has the ability to either exacerbate fissures, or it has the resources that can make these fissures appear less important within the overall organization. And so this is, I would say, this is a characteristic of these Deobandi militant groups, is that there's a lot of contention among them. There are different sort of networks that coalesce around specific commanders. And those networks make it very difficult to, say, engage in effective leadership decapitation. But it also makes the organizations, while it makes them robust to certain kinds of efforts to contain them, it also provides a lot of leverage and leeway for the ISI to ensure that the organization remains coherent enough in a way that satisfies the ISI and its objectives.
So is it like this kind of, for example, if this factionalism that is there within the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, what kind of impact can it have in a situation where if the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or what is called the Pakistani Taliban, sets out on a much larger campaign of terrorist attacks, bombings, or whatever within Pakistan. And the Pakistani state tries to pressurize Afghan Taliban to kind of prevent any kind of support for the Pakistani Taliban. What do you think is likely to be the policy of the Afghan Taliban in such a situation?
So obviously this was to be expected, right? Because the United States forced Ghani to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. And they were, of course, the vanguard of this assault on Afghanistan that resulted in the Taliban takeover. But as the Taliban moved throughout Afghanistan, they freed other militant, jihadi militants from prison, which included thousands of these so-called Pakistani Taliban. So, this was absolutely to be expected. But what people do have to understand is that as long as the Pakistani Taliban do not target Punjabis, the Pakistani state is perfectly happy to write off those fatalities as collateral in the service of its larger strategic objective, which is, of course, what they've been able to accomplish in Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban made a huge mistake in 2009 when it targeted Bunair and then went on to target the rest of the Punjab. And it was when they targeted the Punjab that Pakistani public opinion overwhelmingly endorsed military action against the TTP. So if you're a learning organization, and I'm not sure that the TTP is that, but if it is, it would not likely repeat that mistake, right? If it wants to be effective and operational, it can't go to the Punjab. Now, there's arguments for and against them going to the Punjab. So the argument for them not going to the Punjab, quite frankly, is organizational survival. Like they know that will usher forth the ire of the Pakistani army. The argument for taking it to the Punjab is that the TTP obviously is emboldened by what the Taliban has been able to achieve. And they say that if the Taliban can do it in Afghanistan, why can't the Pakistan Taliban do it in Pakistan? So that, and for them to actually do that, they would have to take this fight to the Punjab. The other issue is one of the major factors that resulted in the decline of the TTP was an unrelenting series of drone attacks conducted by the Americans. Like the majority of the drone attacks in Pakistan were targeting TTP activists. They weren't targeting immediately individuals or organizations that were an immediate threat to the United States. The drone community called these goodwill kills, right? We basically kill people on behalf of the Pakistani state for us to get opportunities to do what we wanted to do with this platform. So without the drone program aggressively targeting them, they may in fact feel as if they can attack the Punjab with impunity. But if they do attack the Punjab with impunity, I don't think it's going to be as easy for them, even without the US drones eliminating them. I think that they're going to find, and so the other thing that complicates this, right, is that the Pakistani deep state has been fighting the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, right? This is, basically Pashtuns who have figured out that Pakistan was getting paid to kill terrorists, and they were killing Pashtuns and saying, oh, we're killing terrorists. So Pashtuns really have mobilized in rejection of this business model, if you will. And so the Pakistani state may actually welcome aspects of the TTP because it will allow them to continue to victimize and mischaracterize the nature of the PTM.
So does it, like when you're speaking about the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, we know that there were signs that they were trying to revive their campaign the period just immediately after the Taliban came back to power. But as you mentioned, it is going to be strategically, it's going to be very difficult for them to launch the kind of campaign that they had launched in 2009. But the fact that Afghanistan has been completely come under the control of the Afghan Taliban, does it mean that it frees up much more larger number of fighters, Taliban fighters, to fight on behalf of the Pakistani Taliban?
So I think the biggest mischaracterization of the Pakistani Taliban is this conflation with the Afghan Taliban, right? They're not, the organizations are not like this, right? The Pakistani Taliban have been much more focused upon Pakistan as a theater, not Afghanistan. So what the Pakistanis have sought to do at different points in time to try to rehabilitate wayward Pakistani Taliban is that, it's given them two options, really. One is to go into Afghanistan and support the Afghan Taliban. So the vector is the other way, right? Try to get Pakistani Taliban to go to Afghanistan. The other vector, if you will, is a Garvapasi for wayward Pakistani Taliban, is to have them join Jaish-e-Mohammed, right? These are all Deobandi organizations. And so that was a really important element in the Pakistan Army's strategy of dealing with the Pakistan Taliban. It's why it spent so much time trying to rehabilitate Jaish-e-Mohammed. Jaish-e-Mohammed went through a pretty serious split in very late 2001, early 2002. Most of Masood Hazar's organization actually defected against him. He argued against targeting the Pakistani state. The vast majority of his confederates in Jaish disagreed, and they would eventually form, the backbone of the Pakistani Taliban. So that's always been a key element of the Pakistani strategy of trying to reorient the Pakistan Taliban. They were very hesitant to comprehensively go after all of them because they're still, at the end of the day, assets that the Pakistani state could deploy in the service of its foreign policy. But at the end of the day, when those individuals demurred from accepting these other opportunities, the Pakistani state killed them. So it's not that the Afghan Taliban are fleeing to Pakistan to help. The Afghan Taliban, they have an opportunity to begin resurrecting their emirate. So it'll be the other way around. That is to say, the Pakistani state will try to induce, if you will, the members of the Pakistani Taliban to go help the Afghan Taliban.
Yeah. So is it, what are the changes in the nature of Pakistani state support for the Afghan Taliban from the 1990s and early 2000s to the last 20 years, almost 20 years of insurgency, and any changes that could have happened after the Taliban had come to power recently?
I no. I mean, the answer is no. I mean, the Pakistanis throughout the last 20 years, even while they were allegedly allies of the Americans, never stopped their support for the Taliban, right? The Quetta Shura is in Quetta, it's not in Kandahar. And there was the Miran Shah Shura, there was the Peshawar Shura, there was the Karachi Shura, there was the Rawalpindi Shura. So the Pakistanis have simply been unrelenting. And, the Americans were never able or willing to get their head around the nature of, this isn't to say the Americans didn't know that Pakistan was perfidious. Even now, right? It's very frustrating. I can't say it without anger, to be honest. Even though the Pakistanis have been overwhelmingly responsible for the murder of Americans in Afghanistan, not to mention our allies, specifically the Afghans themselves in very large number, there are people like Michael Kugelman, there are people, even like people like Bruce Riedel, who are arguing that whatever Pakistan did, wo hua, jo hua, wo hi hua. And we have to find some way of continuing to work with the Pakistanis. I find this kind of logic to be extraordinary, like not in a good way, extraordinary, like really effing maddening, extraordinary. But Pakistan has this, I have to give them credit. They have this ability to manage the Washington problem set really well. They have this simultaneous ability to say, if you don't continue supporting us, we are so dangerous, we might explode, right? So in other words, monetizing their fake precarity. But on the other hand, saying that we are so strong and we are so important that you are going to need us to manage the security threats that we, in fact, are responsible for generating in Afghanistan. And they're perfectly capable of simultaneously weaponizing, on the one hand, this fake precarity, on this other hand, this sort of faux omnipotence. And the Americans fall for it time and time again. So I was hoping that this would be a time when the Americans could step back, could look at things with a more sober eye, and think about a more coercive policy to deter Pakistan from this kind of obnoxious adventurism. But I don't see that happening. So I think for many of us that work on this problem set, we're exhausted, we're sick and tired of talking about it, because what we understand is that there's literally nothing that the Pakistanis can do to undermine US interests that will ever be significant enough that will precipitate the kind of response that it deserves. If harboring Osama bin Laden and killing 3,000 plus soldiers, in addition to really countless contractors, in addition to civilian workers, I mean, the total death toll in Afghanistan, who knows what it is, because of the secrecy surrounding the deaths of contractors. But whatever the number is, if this isn't enough for the Americans to treat Pakistan like it's treated Iran, what else does it need to do? So I think just many of us are just tired. There will always be the jet set, like the Michael Kugelmans, that will endlessly argue for the importance of Pakistan. And the vacuity of those arguments will actually succeed, despite their vacuity.
We know that Pakistan has been conducting these activities, trying to influence and place a friendly regime in Afghanistan for these so many years.
Well, to be precise, I want to be precise about this number, right? People think that the Pakistanis are very good at mischaracterizing history, because the people that they talk to are usually historical ignoramuses. What must be known is that the Pakistanis have been trying to influence the regime in Afghanistan since the late 1950s. Now, admittedly, its reasons for doing so were legitimate, right? The Afghans rejected the Durand Line. The Afghans said that Pakistan was an illegal successor to the Raj. It initially voted against Pakistan's inclusion in the United Nations, but more importantly, Afghans actually invaded Balochistan and in different agencies of the Fatah. So Pakistan's desire to deal with the Afghan problem set was in reaction to some very poor decisions that the Afghan leadership made. And of course, the Afghan leadership very early on antagonized Pakistan by, flagging this Pashtun issue. And for students of Indian history, they will remember that in the 1936 elections and in the 1936-37 and 46-47 elections, Pashtuns did not vote with the Muslim League. They voted for the Indian National Congress, and they didn't want to be a part of Pakistan, right? So Pakistan, from the earliest days, viewed Pashtuns as a potential enemy to the project of Pakistan. So when the Afghans began weaponizing Pashtun nationalism, this really did provoke a very strong response in the Pakistani state. So much so that by the time we get to 1973, right, long before the Soviets invaded, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto actually sets up the ISI cell to begin turning Afghan Islamists who were fleeing the crackdown by Dawood into what would become the 7 main so-called Mujahideen groups. So long before the Soviets invaded, Pakistan was essentially launching this jihad policy, and it did it. And in fact, Abdul Sattar, who has written about this, he's, among other things, Pakistan's foreign affairs minister. Also, General Arif, in his book, Working with Zia, my sources, these are all Pakistani sources. And they make it very clear that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto did this because it was in Pakistan's interest to do. So it's just really important that people not buy these stories that this is recent, that this has that Pakistan began this at the compulsion of, under American compulsion. In fact, Zulfikar and then Zia had been begging President Carter to support this effort that the Pakistanis had launched of their own initiative. And Carter wasn't having it. In April of 1979, even sanctioned Pakistan for nuclear enrichment progress. And of course, by the time we get to the summer of 1979, Brzezinski says to Carter, we're going to have to rethink our nuclear commitments because we're going to have to work with this regime. But it's ultimately, Zia prevails upon Reagan. And it's not that the United States sucked Pakistan into our policy. It was just the other way around. Once the Soviets invaded, and Reagan, of course, was the president, he won the 1980 election. Essentially, Zia was finally able to get the Americans on board to this Pakistani project. So this isn't 20 years. This has actually been going back to the first decade of the Pakistani state.
But do you feel that Pakistan has attained its goal of gaining strategic depth in Afghanistan at the present juncture? Or do you feel that there are complications that Pakistan is likely to face in this situation?
It's going to face complications, right? As I said, as long as the TTP doesn't attack the Punjab, the state will write this off as collateral, right? The Pakistanis, I don't have to be more blunt about it. Even though Pashtuns serve in disproportionate numbers in the army, along with Punjabis, and so there is this, if you will, this collaborator echelon of Pashtuns that are a part of this state. They're not full partners in this Pakistani state project. So as long as the TTP doesn't attack the Punjab and only remains focused upon Pashtun areas, the Pakistani state will write those off as just collateral, civilian collateral in the service of strategic depth. And so, sorry, I'm not a morning person and I have no idea what's going on with my throat. So from the Pakistani point of view, this is really an enormous victory. The Pakistanis had an exaggerated vision of the Indian presence in Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis know that Afghans pretty much detest Pakistan. So being able to basically exclude India from Afghanistan is a victory that Pakistan is willing to accept, even if it causes Pashtuns and the tribal areas and in KPK to die. It's a price they're willing to pay. Obviously, and we can discern from their behavior.
I just got two more questions, which I just want to focus on. One is, we know that the Deobandi groups that you mentioned, how much is ethnicity factor in the breakup of Deobandi groups, like, for example, Pashtun versus Punjabi Deobandi militia groups, organizations? Like, do they split up on the basis of ethnicity, like Pashtun versus Punjabi? Within, say, for example, something like the former Harkatul Mujahideen, and the emergence of the Jaish-e-Mohammed. Is it more to do with ethnic differences, Pashtun versus Punjabi, those kind of issues?
No, I don't think so. Right. I don't think so. The participants in these Deobandi projects, they do tend to be either Pashtun or Punjabi, right? Those are, I mean, you can look at what we have of like their recruitment materials. It does seem as if they're primarily coming from the Punjab and Balochistan, Pashtuns. But remember, there's also a large number of Pashtuns in Balochistan. And so I think one of the more interesting frictions is not Punjabis and Pashtuns within these Deobandi organizations. It's actually the friction between Pashtuns and Baloch, right? So if you look at Pashtun voting behavior in Balochistan, they will vote for JUI, you know, the Deobandi political party. And for many non-Baloch in Balochistan, they see these jihadi organizations as a way of tempering Baloch nationalism, right? So I think the interesting fusion isn't between, it means the level of these jihadi groups. I think the real tension is what you see in Balochistan.
And thank you. And finally, I just wanted to ask a question. Is there a difference in the attitude of the attitude towards Afghan Taliban between the Pakistani army and the ISI? Is there a difference between the two? Or is just one and the same?
So sometime, I guess it was Ambassador Oakley. He is the one that popularized this notion of the rogue ISI. And he did this because Congress was getting pretty wary of Pakistan, even during the anti-Soviet jihad, because of Pakistan's nuclear proliferation activities. A.Q. Khan was throughout that period boasting about how Pakistan was, you know, a screwdriver turn away from having a bomb. And so to manage the ever-present irritation within Congress amongst the non-proliferation lobby, who were in constant opposition to the Cold Warriors, who thought that we had to work with Pakistan no matter what because of the presence of the Soviets in Afghanistan. So to kind of manage those fissures, he came up with this rogue ISI. You know, this is all the ISI, it's rogue. And it is just complete nonsense. There is no rogue ISI. And the reason why there is no rogue ISI is that the head of the ISI, he goes back to the army, right? If he screws up, his career ends, right? So no one wants to end their career. People who are seconded to the ISI, you know, countless people of different ranks are seconded to the ISI from the army. They come back to the army, right? So the army executes command and control. And even the people who retire as DGISI, you know, the Pakistan army takes care of its own. It's a womb to tomb organization. They have very nice opportunities post-retirement in this broad pantheon of organizations run by the Fauji Foundation or or other organizations that are organized similarly. So there's the idea that the ISI is rogue is just, it's absurd. And I reject it summarily. So it is not the case. Now, look, the army itself is a very large organization. And what I always find very interesting about the Pakistan Army is that when some of these guys retire, they talk like sensible human beings. But when they're in uniform, they don't talk like sensible human beings. But there's always a motive for even the people who talk sensibly after they retire. Why do they do this? There's this whole other secondary industry of what I call the track 2 boondoggle. These retired generals that say, oh, we should have peace with India or whatever. They get these really nice vacations paid for in fun locales. And there is a corresponding constituency in India that just loves them some boondoggles. And we could do an experiment. If you actually wanted to put these peaceniks to the test, they could have all of their track 2s in Helmand. And then we're going to see how many peace enthusiasts they are, right? Because it's easy to feign being a peacenik if you're in Chiang Mai. But if you put those people in Helmand, all of a sudden, I think you would find not a lot of interest in these track 2 boondoggles.
Thank you, Professor. Purvaja, I think we can take up questions from the floor right now. So there's your kind of.
Thank you, Shelly, sir. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'll go directly to my first question to Dr. Fair. Pakistan has always been a partner of the US due to its close connection with militant groups in Afghanistan in the war against terror. So given that currently the government of Pakistan has welcomed Taliban with open arms in direct contravention of US policy in Afghanistan, do you see any major change which may occur in US-Pakistan relations in the near future? Dr. Fair?
Yeah, so I mean, to some extent, I already addressed that issue. So this, as an American citizen, I have a lot of questions about why it is that the US government itself did a U-turn on its position with respect to the Taliban. We know that when Zalmay Khalilzad became the special representative, US policy on the Taliban, it did a 180, right? We went from the Taliban is an enemy that has to be confronted and defeated, right? And it was in the service of that the US military and our NATO allies attempted, various strategies in 6-month increments. I mean, I'm very cynical about these attempts. I mean, they failed because they deserve to fail. But Zalmay Khalilzad comes in under Trump, and he basically sells the idea that the Taliban need to be a part of the government. And, this is, it's sort of an interesting puzzle. Elsewhere, the US government would never say that an organization that has waged an illegitimate war, a murderous war on its own civilians should then be part of the government by virtue of their ability to murder more civilians. It's a really strange turn of events. And if you speak to people who previously worked with Zalmay in the Trump White House, they will say, this is because of Zal. My good friend, Lisa Curtis, who I strongly recommend you bring, and unlike me, I'm not a morning person. So you're like, oh, I'm just not myself in the morning. I'm a night person and I work late into the night. So getting up at this early is just not me. But Lisa is a morning person. Lisa has human children. So she's been accustomed to getting up early, and she had worked in the government for a long time. So Lisa's a morning person. You got to get Lisa on this. She'll tell you this wasn't the US government. This was Zal. And Zalmay Khalilzad is a dark, dodgy character with a very unscrupulous past. People may remember, if they're old enough to remember, he brought the Taliban to UNICAL headquarters in Texas in the late 90s. He's all suited, booted, and he's got, his Taliban associates there in their shalwar kameezes and their flip-flops. So he was a very early normalizer of the Afghan Taliban in the 1990s. And the reason is he worked for UNICAL. He wanted to bring the UNICAL pipeline. And it was also US policy in the late 1990s. It was the de facto I was an intern, actually. My first job of any consequence, even though it wasn't paid, was an intern in the Mumbai consulate, the US consulate in Mumbai. But even as an intern, you're still read in on what is US policy to other countries in the region. And so we were told that a policy was a de facto recognition of the Taliban, that they would bring stability. And I remember very clearly, and there would have been no reason for me to have, I was just I had different interests when I was a youngster than I do now. But it actually explicitly stated the UNICAL pipeline. So if you have tracked Zalmay's career over the last 20 years, wherever he goes, controversy follows. So he was the ambassador in Iraq. He and his wife were investigated for money laundering. When he left the ambassadorship in Baghdad, he invested in a resource extraction firm. Now, so my question as a US taxpayer is, what motivated him to turn US policy on its head and support this organization that is so clearly devoid of any legitimate constituency in Afghanistan? I think I know the answer, but I'm hoping that the US Congress will begin asking that question, and we'll look at what, now that he's resigned. Look, Zalmay is not a person of integrity, right? Why is he resigned? I have very strong suspicions that he has lined up some interesting side deals with the Taliban. He was also a very early proponent of Karzai. And it is interesting to see how Karzai has had a resurrected career as a consequence of this Taliban takeover. So there's something not halal about what Zalmay has done and the policy change that he has effectuated. And there are many people across the US government who are just as befuddled as I am. So going to the question posed, as the structural determinants of the US-Pakistan relationship remain unchanged by this, right? It's not as if the Americans fought to the very end and were defeated by the Taliban. It's that Zalmay Khalilzad used his office that was supposed to serve the national interest of the country to make the case that the Taliban are a legitimate governing instrument of Afghanistan. And under his influence, he forced the Afghan government to make an array of dangerous concessions to the Taliban, and the Taliban never honored their commitments. So going to the motivation of the question, no, there's not going to be a structural reevaluation of the US-Pakistan relationship. Everyone knows what it is. No one's fooled by Pakistan's perfidy. The question is, many Americans still think that they need Pakistan for a variety of reasons. And that isn't changed by this policy that Zalmay Khalilzad was able to effectuate.
Thank you, Dr. Fair, for that detailed answer and explaining it so well. The next question is, do you think the Taliban takeover will have a spillover effect on the situation in Kashmir? As in, of course, the rise in militant attacks, which we have been witnessing for the last few days. And how much of a threat of that is tangible? Should India be concerned? And the Afghan Taliban has assured, has given an assurance that in Afghan territory will not be used to launch an attack on any country. So can they be trusted in keeping this in mind? And does Pakistan then have a significant influence on the Taliban?
Okay, so in reverse order, of the Taliban are a solely owned subsidiary of the Pakistani state. So of course they have influence. Two, Afghanistan will most certainly be used to attack other states. It has been, it will be. Three, the Kashmir issue is just a lot more complicated. So unfortunately, the current regime in India undertook a number of policies in Kashmir that were probably not wise. Now, look, I'm a constitutionalist, so the idea of revoking Article 370 in principle is not repugnant to someone like me, right? If the motivations had, if the Modi government had actually followed through with what it said it was going to do, so for example, use the revocation of Article 370 to deepen and expand private sector investment in Kashmir. We can have a lengthy discussion about how that would have been helpful. But that's actually not what the government ended up doing. What the government did and is doing is seeking to essentially denude and then repopulate the political space. So in some senses, the mainstream Kashmiri political parties are being treated like enemies of the state, when in fact, at very high personal risk to themselves, they remain loyal to the Indian state. So this is really quite perverse. And of course, I'm sympathetic to the dilemma here. I mean, I understand the constraints under which India operates. So India cannot appreciably diminish the harshness of the counterinsurgency grid, knowing that Pakistan continues dedicated to causing instability in Kashmir. The problem with the counterinsurgency grid, as is well known, and I would only know this because Indian journalists have reported on it, as well as Indian human rights organizations. It's well known the oppression and I would say unprofessionalism of some of these security forces. So it creates a really bad feedback loop that India has yet been able to crack. So when these security forces engage in oppressive behavior, it motivates Kashmiris who are not on the payroll of Pakistan to mobilize. Then Pakistan exploits those mobilizations, which causes another round of crackdowns, which result in these abuses and so forth and so on. It is a cycle. I do not envy any Indian policymaker, right? And I think it was hoped that by making these union territories, by making the state security apparatus answerable to the center, that they would be able to break the corrupt linkage between the political parties and the police. And so there's a lot of sense to that. But one of the problems, you know, and I say this, you know, as a friend of India, and this I think is a more systemic problem in India, and Indians have written about it. And I'm acutely aware of it as an American. And that's this issue of police behavior. I see a lot of similarities between the similarities are in some cases in the obverse, right? So the Indian police are overwhelmingly inappropriately armed and inappropriately trained, right? The origins of the Indian police are really colonial in mindset, right? They're supposed to control the population. So it's a very different notion of policing than exists elsewhere. And so in some cases, professional police are really important to dealing with insurgency and terrorism. So for the case of Northern Ireland, in my case, as an American, our police are overarmed. In fact, they are heavily militarized. But what our two police forces have in common, apart from very significant impacts of federalism, as one would expect in federal democracies, is that our police forces tend to have notions that some of our citizens are enemies, and that those enemies need to be treated with good old-fashioned military therapy, right? And when it comes to insurgency, those kinds of apprehensions about the local populace are not helpful. And so you have an important apparatus like the CRPF who go into Kashmir. Obviously, they're not Kashmiri, that's kind of the point. And they view Kashmiris as a potential enemy rather than as a citizen. So as an American who has a very brutal, corrupt police force where the police kill with impunity, very few of them ever go to jail, I see a lot of similarities. And when you alienate the population that you're supposed to be policing, this only redounds to the benefit of your adversary. So as someone who's been watching this, I'm a little bit dismayed by the overall characterization of every stone thrower in Kashmir as a Pakistani agent. This isn't the case. So as a result of Indian policy, you have people who are now rejecting the Indian state, not because the Pakistanis are behind them, but because they've come to conclude that on the one hand, India says we're citizens of the state, but on the other hand, we're not treated like equal citizens of the state. And on top of that, you also have this very real problem of the Pakistanis weaponizing segments of that dissatisfaction. So if it were a problem set that could easily be resolved, it would have been resolved. And the Pakistanis are always willing to take advantage of the Indian inability to make meaningful reforms that would help ameliorate the seemingly endless set of crises in Kashmir. But I really encourage you to look really hard at what this current government has done, what it said its intentions were, and then ask, did it follow through with any of the salutary planning that it had promised? What I can see from the outside, and admittedly, India doesn't let foreigners in right now, so it's hard. I have to rely upon Indian reporting. I can't go and see for myself, but what I can tell from Indian reporting is that none of those salutary things happened, but the repression has continued.
Purvaja, can you hear me?
Yes, Shali sir. Sir,
Yeah,
we're
there is a
almost
question
out
about-
of time. So would you like to take over and maybe ask a last question in conclusion before I close today's proceedings?
Okay, yeah. Professor Fair, just the last question. What I wanted to ask is, what do you see the future of U.S.-Pakistan relations? How is it? What impact is this development likely to have on U.S.-Pakistan relations? That is the last.
I've already answered that repeatedly. It's this relationship is overdetermined by strategic interests.
So it's not likely to be not much change in terms of U.S. policy towards Pakistan.
If anyone's thinking that the Americans are going to sanction Pakistan, I don't see that happening. I wish it would happen, but I don't see it happening.
Thank you, Professor Fair. It's been a very fruitful discussion, close to 1 hour. And you have answered all of the addressed all of the points that we have raised in this point of this discussion, and you have brought forth the complexity in the entire issue, and maybe aspects which are not really available in the mainstream media on the nature of the conflict, because we have a lot of assumptions that we get from the mainstream media, which are not necessarily the reality of the ground level situation. So I would like to thank you personally and on behalf of CPPR for taking the trouble. I know that you mentioned that the timing is not very it is not very suitable for you, but you're taking
that's not your fault. That's my fault. My Mondays, I get home so late because I teach night. So Mondays I teach in the morning and night. So I get home at like 10 o'clock at night. And so by the time I have dinner and go to bed, it's late. And so it's not your fault. It's my fault. And Mondays just mean that my Tuesday mornings are terrible. So I apologize if I'm not my usual self.
But even then, I would like to appreciate for all the trouble that you've taken to interact with us and put forward your views on this very vital topic that is, I'm sure, is going to be very important in the times to come. So thank you very much for
thank you.
With us and taking this time.
But I hope you get my friend Lisa Curtis. I mean, I strongly encourage you to get Lisa Curtis. She was actually at Doha. She can tell you, I mean, she was a part of the negotiating process, and she's now at CNAS. She's no longer in the US government. I think she would give you a very worm's eye view of these negotiations. And I know for a fact that, she was one that was really trying to put a wrench in what Zalmay was doing, but, it was impossible to undermine Zal. So hopefully you'll get Lisa Curtis. I think she'd be a really good explainer of what happened in Doha.
Thank you for making that suggestion. In fact, I think we'll have to think about it and get into the nature of these negotiations that are taking place. So I think that'll be a very good suggestion. So thank you very much.
Right.
So
have a great night, guys.
Purvaja, so
thank you, Shelly sir.
Good morning.
Thank you, Shelly sir, and thank you, Dr. Fair, for your interesting insights on the developments in the region and for your recommendation to host Lisa Curtis. We will definitely take that up. Thank you to all the participants for logging in and listening so intently and for all your numerous questions. I'd also like to thank our organizing team at CPPR. A special shout out to Vinny for brainstorming and conceptualizing this webinar series, to Joseph, Neetu, Paul, and Rajesh pulling this event together. And with this, I'd like to formally close today's proceedings. Good evening and goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Fair. Thank you, Shelly sir.
Thank you, Purvaja. Thank you all.